should be okay. I'm just going to review that. We're actually going to use it for the rest of the course, so it's worth doing. So this is, if you get it, I understand you'll be bored a little bit, but just bear with me. The value of labor power is equal to things. Workers get this value, that's the wage that they receive from the capitalists, and they go out and purchase, consumption, goods and services. So on the right-hand side is their consumption. I'm assuming they're not saving it, so the savings is zero. So they go out and buy goods and services. The one portion of it, because it's a market economy, they have to buy the goods and services at market prices. It's trivial. You can't go to Whole Foods and say, I want that apple, and take it, because they'll arrest you. So you have to pay a price. You have to take a portion of your income and buy the apple. That's what this is. So that's the price of an apple, the value of an apple in the numerator, and the number of apples in the denominator. That's that Q that you asked for. I use the UVs because that's what Marx uses. Times the number of apples. If it's a gorgeous apple and you spend $4, you'll buy one apple if your wage is $4. If the price of an apple, your wage is $4, and the price of an apple falls to $2 per apple, you can buy more apples. So the more apples, that's your real consumption. Okay? That's the quantum of basket of consumer goods that you have command over, that you can consume, corrected for price changes. So what economists do there is they deflate their money wage by the prices to get their real standard of living, their real command over consumer goods. And you can see, just to make it dramatic, if you get the same income, money income, and prices increase rapidly with inflation, then your command over consumer goods is going to fall. All right. One of the most famous examples of that was in Germany after World War I. In Germany, in the 1920s to the early 30s, the prices just took off. It was called hyperinflation. It's a nice description. And if the German wages remained the same, their real incomes fell. And that phenomenon helped in its way to bring about Adolf Hitler out of that hyperinflation. He promised that he would put a stop to this, which he did. Okay, so this is, there's no matter potatoes in this idea of price movements and real income. First step. Second step. I want to then manipulate this equation. That's all I'm doing now. And this indicates the change in the value of labor power as a result of changes in its right-hand side. So what I'm doing here is, A is equal to B times C. So I'm saying, okay, how does A change over time? Well, the change is the change in B times C plus the change in C times B. So all I'm doing is, I know that there's two things on the right-hand side. I want the contribution of each to the total change. That's all I'm doing. So over here, I want to see the contribution of a change in prices to the change in the real basket of goods. Whoops, don't mind, delta. That's all I'm doing. I'm getting the contribution of each part to the total change, the value of labor power. And it turns out that in the States, this value of those goods in dollar terms falls by more than this goes up, this arrow is down is bigger than this arrow. So this negative is bigger than this positive. And so the product of those two things is a decrease in the value of labor power. So it's possible to have an increase in the real wage. So it's possible to have an increase in the real wage. That's this thing here. That's the real wage. We all want that. And therefore, implying real consumption. Real consumption. Assuming no savings. It's possible to have a rising real wage and a falling value of labor power. And Marx provides a theory enabling people to see that because you don't see it. So that's what theory always does. It makes us aware of something going on in society that we don't see or that we can't think about. That's what theories do. So this particular theory says, look, it's possible to have a rising real wage in consumption and a falling value of labor power if the fall in the unit value is larger than the rise in the real wage. Third step in the argument. Is to examine this. What exactly is that? In terms of what we've done in the class. So we have to, it has two parts. It has a numerator and it has a denominator. So let's get at the numerator. We have C plus B plus SV is equal to W. That's the formula we've developed and we've used. And I'll put over here the number of use values, the number of things that are produced. So let's use some numbers. Let's have two ways of doing this. Dollars and hours. Whoops. Sorry. So let's assume that producers of this particular product have to go out and spend $4 on raw materials and machines to produce whatever the apples, whatever the quantity is. Plus $2 of wages, this is all in dollars. $2 they get in profits, $4, $6, $8, and they produce, I'll make it easy, one thing. Two things doesn't make a difference. I'll use one because it's easy for me. And for simplification reasons, I'm going to assume that the dollar is worth 4 hours. I'm assuming, as I told you, $1 is equal to 1 hour. Plus 2 plus 2 is equal to 8, it's the same thing. So there's two different standards. There's a dollar and an hour standard. You can use one, the other, or both, doesn't make any difference. One to consistent. This, which I did not do last time, but let me do it this way. What is this C again? This says, okay, suppose this is a machine. This is an input into this industry. So the capitalists here have to purchase this machine at $4, which is worth 4 hours, under the assumption. But let's not forget that that input into this industry is an output from some other industry. It's not manna from heaven. So the purchase of machines by one industry are the same machines that have been produced by a different industry, machine industry. And there, the W of these machines, which is a C for the buying industry, but the W for the selling industry is $4 or 4 hours. So behind the blackboard, there's another one over here, the machine industry of a C plus B plus S is equal to W. And there, whatever the numbers are, 2 plus 1 plus 1, 4, oops, 2, 3, got 4. there's another one. Okay? Don't get them mixed up. This is in the selling industry. The machine good industry that's selling to this industry. Okay, so that's where this $4 comes from. By the same logic, the $2 reflects the cost of the wage goods. That's the first equation I'm going to apply. That's what the workers have to purchase to sustain themselves. And it takes 2 hours to produce those goods. Okay. Let's do the arithmetic together. So this is 8 over 1, or 8 hours over 1. If I've done this correctly. Now, the reciprocal, the upside down of it. So all I'm doing is, whoops, my goodness gracious. All I'm doing is taking the reciprocal of this. So this would be okay. This, as I said, it was a nickel 5 pennies. There are 2 different ways of writing the same thing. Let's do it in English. This is the value of 1 apple. $8. The value per apple. This is the apples per dollar, or over here, the apples per ounce. This is the amount of apples produced over the 8 hours. This is called in economics the productivity of labor. So the productivity of labor is your numerator, which is the wealth yielded by the denominator. Okay? So 8 hours gives us 1 hour. It's the reciprocal of the value per unit. Okay, last part of this. Suppose it were the case, let's take our country, in the United States, that the productivity of labor really increased dramatically. Suppose it were the case that this productivity really went up over time. Tremendous increase in the productivity of labor. That would imply that the value per unit would fall. The quantum of labor required to produce something is falling. The quantum of labor required to produce a thing is falling. The quantum of labor, in labor terms, the hours, okay, is falling. It no longer takes 8 hours. It takes 6, 7, 4, 3, 2, 1. A half an hour. That's the same thing as saying that the productivity of any amount of labor is rising. So what used to take thousands of hours to produce an automobile, during World War I, now just takes a few hours. The productivity of labor of the automobile worker has increased dramatically, and that pushes this down. And I can't think of any country in the world in which the productivity of labor has risen to the degree that it has, pushing down the unit value per unit of these goods. So the question is why? Well, Mr. Engels, not the only one here, but he gives you the reason. So I ask you a question on this. He's saying, okay, the productivity of labor rises in the United States, and hence the value per unit falls, pushing down on the value of labor power. He's giving a theorization of why this happens. One is a mechanization that occurs. And you'll notice that we went through it. Rise in C over C plus V. increased use of machines. It's not just that, though. The machines embody new technologies. You know, it's unlike a vintage wine. The newest wine has the best technology. You know, typically, older wines taste better. In this case, when it comes to machines, the newer machines embody the new technology. So, one reason is the deployment of all kinds of new machines and equipment and new technologies throughout the system, which raise the productivity of labor, which pushes us down. But it's not just machines. It's also management techniques. I can't think of a country that's gone as far as it has in terms of the managerial revolution. You've probably heard those words. It's not just a technological revolution, but it's the managerial revolution. Managers have, been educated, trained, or whatever, to learn how to deploy and make use of all of these new machines and technology and education. Most of the education that takes place in the States takes place in corporations. They train people on how to use these new machines and so forth, etc. It doesn't take that long, it turns out. So, this rise in productivity has got to do with many, many things. Education, management techniques, technologies, and machines. And as a result of that, the cost of goods falls. And if this falls by more than the real wage rises, then you have, by this logic, a decrease in the value of labor power. And then to go back to what we did, if this is falling, then this is rising. Whoops. So the value added and you have a rising rate of exploitation consistent with a rising real wage. People aren't aware of it. They're not conscious of it. And as I suggested to you, some people have argued, not necessarily this guy Kowski, but other people have argued that it's quite possible they're not aware of it because the rising consumption disguises the rising rate of exploitation. One reason they're not conscious of that which is occurring. I'm going to give you some better numbers than I gave you last time. To show you how dramatic this is in our country. Between, I'll stop where I started last time, 1890 and 1978. So this is the real wage. Whoops. And this is the productivity of labor. In the United States. In industry only, not agriculture, not state, not wholesale trade or retail trade, only in industry. If you want manufacturing. And then I'll go 1978 to 2000. I think I did it. I didn't have any numbers afterwards. So this goes up 1.8% per year at a compound rate. That's really dramatic. Almost 2% per year. As I said to you, if you put your money in a bank for such a long period of time, and at a growth rate of 2%, you do okay. So there's no question that this has gone up over the long sweep of American industrialization. The frontier in the United States, supposedly, according to the historians, is over by 1890. So it's become an urban industrial country by then, after the Civil War. Between then and 1978, towards the end of the 20th century, we have a dramatic increase in the real income of most Americans. At least half the labor force. This grows by 2.3%. So, in just simple English, the workers are contributing to output at the rate of 2.3% This is unbelievable. Again, for compound rate of growth. But they're getting back less than what they contribute. Rising rate of exploitation.
So these numbers still like...
This is from the federal government.
Are these numbers still expanding? Like, are they still...
Then the question is, this question. Okay, it's intriguing. What is it today? Okay, so the numbers. 1978 to 2007, 3.3%. Wow. You might attribute this incredible rate of growth over this period of time, the last few decades, to the computer revolution. A new kind of technology that has been introduced. It's not just been introduced, it's been actually, people understand how to use it. When computers first came about, for me, it was in the 1960s, I had no idea what to do with it. I mean, I really just didn't know. No one did at that time. So there's a massive learning process that's gone on, and people how to use this stuff. Okay. So this is really a rapid rate of growth. This continues. I don't have the numbers, but it continues up until today. That's right. You need to squint. It's negative. So the real wage is falling. Yeah. It's a geometric growth per year. Well, it's the average over the whole time. Now, that's not much. I mean, I understand that it's not, if you put it on a graph, it almost looks constant. But compared to this, I'm sorry, you have a feeling now, and you don't have to agree with this, but just describe why people get upset. Now, Kautsky and Engels and Marx thought that people want to, the workers would get upset. And it would be, if they thought there would be a revolution, blah, 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 and people would argue socialism. But can you also see that it's also possible to go the other way with this? That you can have a revolution from the right? Can you also see that you can have a Tea Party?
Condone the system if you have.
I'm sorry?
I can see how people would condone the system if you happen to be like capitalists or own the property. I don't know why would they revolt or like change it?
Why wouldn't they change it?
Why would they? Were you just trying to say that they would change it?
Well, if you have a worker whose real wage has fallen a bit and is into debt and so forth, etc., and faces healthcare costs, losing the pension and so forth, etc. Make you terribly upset.
Yeah, I can see why the worker would be upset.
It doesn't mean that person is necessarily going to pick up this book and read it, because you're not supposed to read this. But you read a different book, which is on the radio all the time. Yeah.
From the point of view of the worker whose labor productivity is increased, I would think that they would see that as a benefit, because instead of carrying refrigerators by hand, now they get a dolly, they can move twice as many, their job's easier, yeah, they're more productive, but I don't think they would see that as being exploited.
I understand, because they haven't had the theory. They certainly would not. Absolutely correct. And every time that theory of exploitation has to be taught, the person, if it were 1952, you're arrested. You learn your lesson. There's only one place, as far as I know, in the United States in which you get 373. Can't struggle with these ideas. Obama, just once, I think I told you this, presented what I just did. This phrase right here, just once in one of his speeches. I remember, I think I mentioned it to you, I've actually mentioned it again. I turned to my wife and we were listening to this speech, and I said to her, my God, he did my lecture. I feel really good. I didn't get any credit, but he did my lecture. She giggled. That's the last time he ever said it. I'm sure his handlers got to him and said, don't wake up the sleeping dog of class struggle. You ain't going to get elected. You socialist. Okay, next. Let's go back to Mr. Kautsky. Okay? Besides this. So, Kautsky says, socialism for him, he picks right up with Mr. Engels, is the end of the private ownership and private production. So he's going to have instead collective ownership. So he's going to follow Engels' kind of rule here. He's going to get rid of the private ability of the capitalist to stop accumulation, the cost of business cycle, blah, 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 and to have people buying and selling the labor power, out of which is going to come exploitation. He's going to collectivize the markets, so we don't have private markets anymore, and that anarchy, and this macro, this massive inefficiency that we have. So he's going to, just what Engels said in Engels' cookbook, he's going to abolish the relations, private relations of production, private relations of production, and private markets. And then he, just like Engels, claims that if you do that, once again, you have this correspondence between the socialized forces and the socialized relations, the collectivization of ownership, the planning, and that'll unleash the forces of production so that we will have the world of plenty. So, he also, I think one of you asked me, he also has the vision, which he mentions in the science view, of socialism is kind of a big factory. Socialism would be kind of one factory in which the workers would own all the means of production. And there would be planning by state planners. And when you have that kind of situation, then he argues that socialism has delivered on the historic mission of capitalism. In what way? Well, it's done what capitalism is supposed to do, which is unleash the forces of production and capitalism. The problem with capitalism, according to Mr. Kautsky, Mr. Engels, and this Orthodox Marxism, is that private relations of production are now fetter, constrain the potential in American or German or French society. That's why you got to get rid of those private relations of production to unleash the potential in the forces of production. With words, which a lot of people have picked up, is that socialism is progressive and capitalism is not. So what he's done here is turn Adam Smith on his head. Adam Smith had just the opposite message. It was capitalism that was progressive. So Kautsky's done this clever move is made socialism the progressive mode of production. And capitalism has outlived its usefulness. It's accomplished this dramatic cheapening of goods and of wealth through the revolution, increasing the productivity of labor, but its incessant business cycles prevent it from continuing and cause this macro inefficiency. Okay, next, Carol. Yes. Yes, sir.
What's an example of a private relation of production?
Well, it's what I did in class.
I mean, a real life example of one, would that be the apples?
I'm sorry?
Would that be apples?
Oh, it would be General Electric. Privately owns the means of production. Okay. So, whether it be in the form of an incorporated corporation or a non-incorporated partnership or whatever, is that the owners own the means of production, and they have therefore the right under the law to private right creates a societal problem. Isn't that clear? Well, we all got that? The private right creates a societal problem. That's the decline rate of problem. For everybody, which causes this downturn. Any questions on that? On that particular point that was just asked, so that's hopefully clearer. Okay. Anyone else? Please ask. Don't hesitate. Okay. I will try and answer. I may not be able to, but I'll try. Okay, next. Okay, I'm leading this, and I'm going to take a little bit of a detour here. Not a detour, but a little bit of footnote to what we have done. I want to present a little bit of Marx. I assigned portions to you, but I want to cover this particular important point of Marx. And then before I turn to Mr. Bernstein. Here's an argument of Marx that he develops in his famous book Capital in the first volume, and it's applicable to what we just did. He says, when you have this capitalism and you have this private ownership of the means of production, and the capitalists privately own their products, so he's picking up Mr. Engels, then clearly the capitalists have to sell them to cover their costs, C plus B, and to realize their profits, the SV. So they have to sell the wealth that is produced. They have to sell the wealth that is produced for them by their workers at the value, at the W, to cover their costs and to get their profit. A commodity is something that's produced for exchange. So capitalists then have to produce wealth for exchange. Why? Once again, cover the C plus V to get to realize the service. Okay. So capitalism is a system in which all kinds of wealth are produced for the market for exchange. Next. Capitalism is a society in which people don't produce things because they are necessarily useful to the people who are producing them. In fact, the usefulness of a product is useful only insofar as it can be produced for the market. That's just another way of saying what I just said. General Electric, GM, Honda, and so forth, they're not happy when they have unsold refrigerators and cars and so forth. They don't want that stuff for their own use. They want it. What do they want? They want to sell that and get a money amount, the W, to cover their costs and make their profits. And so they're continually stimulating their advertising other people's desire and demands for these products so that they can sell them. So capitalism is, it's Boston Gold. Capitalism is a system in which you produce stuff, wealth, for sale, let me add an adjective, for profitable sale. To get that SE, not just to cover your costs. Contrast that with another kind of society, one of which we've all participated, a family society, which I mentioned to you last time. In a family society, or at least in most families, there is not inside the family production for exchange, profitable exchange. You don't do that. Here, people produce wealth for its use. Or in Marxian terms, there is production for use value, not exchange value. There's no market inside a family, typically. Maybe, but typically not. So, my own family, as I mentioned to you, I was the cook. So I would say to my kids, are you going to be home for dinner? They would say, why? I would say, so I'll know how much to purchase. I'm going to come back to this, so it's important in this example. I'll know how much fish, meat, potatoes, vegetables to buy so that I can really not plan my dinner. So if you're going to be late, you've got practice, you've got this particular swimming or track or whatever the case you're doing it. You're going to be late, or if you're not coming home until 8, 9:30, then I'll know how much to buy. I don't want to waste things. Money's tight. I don't want to waste. I don't want to waste resources. So let me know your desire and needs, so I'll know what to buy. I don't say to them, well, I don't care. You can buy or not buy, but I'm going to sell you whatever it is that I'm producing inside this family. They would giggle and laugh. So in a family, in this collectivity, there is the production for use value, not exchange value. In capitalism, there's a production for exchange value, not use value. Yes, sir.
Is this kind of thing where, like, the diamond and water paradox?
Huh?
Is this like the whole black time where the diamond and water paradox comes from? Like, diamonds aren't necessarily useful, but they have value?
No. That's something that Samuelson invented many, many years ago. Paul Samuelson, to get across the supply and demand for product. Water can get the diamonds. That's the first example that was used in this textbook, Supply and Demand, in 1947. So it's nothing new. Okay. Marx argues then, this arrangement in capitalism produces a number of different ironic twists, paradoxes. First, we have a division of labor in capitalism. I mean, people specialize in food production, other people specialize in industrial production. Well, clearly, they have to exchange their products. Why? Because farm workers need industry, industrial products, and industrial products need, food. So there has to be some kind of trade-off, some kind of exchange going on between these two different producing units in order for both of them to survive. Because the minute you have a division of labor and a specialization of tasks, there's got to be some way to exchange the products being produced so that both can survive. In capitalism, second step, in capitalism, those producers do not get together and speak their needs, their relative desires, their use values, their respective use values. They don't do that. That is, the farm workers don't go to the industrial workers and say, okay, this is not any shirts that we need. And the industrial workers don't go to the food workers and say, okay, this is how many pieces of corn that we need. They don't speak to each other. They don't personalize their needs. Instead, the commodities that they produce speak for them. The puppet speaks for the puppeteer. So, the commodities that are being everybody's producing for the market, the commodities, in my example, to contribute to this. Suppose we have apples and shirts. So, in the market, suppose we have one apple is equal to 2 shirts. Okay? So, take an expensive apple, $4 is equal to 2 times $2. So, each apple costs $4, each shirt costs $2, the exchange is 1 apple is equal to 2 shirts. So no one's getting cheap. So we establish a relationship amongst these different products, and the relationship is one of exchange. This is an exchange relationship. It tells you what an apple is worth in terms of shirts, and what one shirt is worth in terms of apples. That's what an exchange relationship is. So in capitalism, the producers, which depend upon each other, do not interact, according to Marx, but rather the products that they produce interact and stand for them and speak for them. So we have this mutual dependence in capitalism. Everybody depends upon everybody else, but no one, once again, articulates their respective needs. Third, suppose it happens, for whatever complicated reason, that people produce too many apples. Good weather, whatever the reason is, technological change. Then, as you all know, with more apples, this is going to change. Because the supply of apples increases relative to its demand. And so that exchange relationship is going to change. And the apple producers are going to have a problem on their hands, because that which they produce, now I'm going to use what I did, and all the resources that they put into it will have been wasted. Because they can't sell their apples to cover their C plus B and realize their profits. There'll be an excess supply of automobiles, TV sets, houses. That's our recession. And hence the prices of that stuff will start to go down. The drop in the price of housing is rather dramatic. It's not just housing, almost everything you can think of in the States. More so than any other country in the world. Because of what I just described. So Marx says, this is crazy. We are allowing the market to create this kind of anarchy, this havoc amongst ourselves in this way. Why don't we just get together and articulate to one another what it is that we need, like we do in a family, so that we don't run into this macro inefficiency of too many apples, too many TV sets, too many cars. My God, is there any way for us to get together to communicate to one another? Let me finish the whole argument. Okay? To communicate with one another so that we do not waste resources by having this cycle. Let us communicate to our respective needs so we'll get it best we can to figure out what it is that we need, demand, so we can match the supply to what we need, so you don't have these gyrations in price. Yes, sir?
So, but isn't only that only in the short term, but in long term?
Yes, both in short and long term.
But I mean, the whole point of like Adam Smith, like the market should equalize itself out, right? If there's excess supply,
It's an argument.
it's up, right? So,
Absolutely.
so isn't his argument only for the short term then?
No, for both short and long term. So you do not get in the long term what I described to you when we first started. So you don't have the wages not sufficient to buy all the goods, and you have to have people going into debt. So the only way you get rid of the excess supply is by people going into debt, which creates a new contradiction, a new crisis, which ends up with a macro problem, which is almost as great as the Great Depression, unless we had done something about it, which we did. So, the argument here is that people in a, this is his argument, people in a strange and bizarre way in capitalism take on, this is his famous argument, a new religion. You know the old religions, but there's a new one, which is people begin to worship the market. That which people have created, because it's an institution like any others, people create the market, they now allow the market to speak for them. They become the puppets of a mysterious force out there, an invisible hand, which determines their lives. And they forget that they control the markets because they created them. So they began to, right now, make a fetish, that's his famous line, make a fetish of markets. They allow the markets to determine their lives. The market becomes like a god, and people begin to worship the market and forget that in this particular case, they created that god, the market. So, an example that I always like to quote on this, because it strikes home, is that people sometimes study and take a major university because of their notion of the market. And I always say to students, don't do that. You have no idea of the market. You don't have a PhD in economics, but even if you did, I do, it's almost impossible to predict the future market. It's not just impossible in the short run, it's impossible in the long run. It's continually changing. That which you think is a job for today disappears tomorrow. So prepare yourselves to be flexible enough to be able to adapt to a particular field, particular change in the market by taking your courses. People take a course of study for 4 years depending upon something that they don't know anything about. That's a derivative of this kind of idea of worshiping the market. So instead of this, he says, why don't we get together, here's his argument for planning, and plan this thing so we don't get these inhibitions. That's the argument that informs Mr. Engels and Mr. Hudson. That's how you deal with this. Now let me take it. Here is a counterclaim. This is the Marxian argument about why markets stink. It produces a kind of alienation of individuals from one another in this crazy religion which worships markets. You end up with this craziness in American society in which you measure people by how much they make or consume. It's all part of this bizarre religion. Which, by the way, your priests, your rabbis, your ministers are always trying to correct. Adam Smith came up with a dramatically different idea which informs neoclassical economics. Unless you're taking notes. Are you taking notes? Are you taking notes? Okay, please. Jesus. How many times is this? Why would you do it? Am I that boring to you? Would you do it to your father? Okay, I'll control it. But it really is disrespectful, especially after the last lecture. Jesus. Okay. The counter-argument, this is interesting stuff. This is Marx versus Adam Smith. Jesus, if you're not interested in that, what the fuck are you interested in? Adam Smith gives a counter-argument, which is that the market, the supply and demand, and the intersection and so forth, will deliver the best of all possible results.
The most efficient.
Good. The most efficient, which he means specifically, the reason he wrote his book, is that a society under private property and competitive markets, that is capitalism, will yield the maximum wealth that the society is capable of producing. That's what he means by efficiency. So, now the capitalism, people will get the maximum wealth they're capable of producing, the maximum profit, the maximum consumption that they're capable of producing. That's his vision in 1776. That's the title of the book, The Wealth of Nations. So he wrote it, okay, in order to tell England and the rest of the countries how to achieve the maximum wealth, which was to put into place capitalism, which was just growing during the day. It started roughly in 1650 in England. So all the things we've been talking about was emerging out of that, okay? Capitalism. It's not just that. Let's take the point one more step. It's not just that you produce the maximum profit and the maximum consumption and the maximum wealth of a society is feasible. If you let everybody alone and let them act in their own private self-interest to maximize their profit and their consumption, then what will happen, according to Adam Smith and all non-Marxian economists thereafter, they'll result in society a perfect harmony. And the first guy that came up with this idea was way after Smith. About 100 years later, his name was Pareto, Italian economist. Smith was a Scottish economist, from Scotland. And Mr. Pareto, Wilfredo Pareto, became so famous, it was known thereafter as Pareto optimality. What it says is, in English, that if you let everybody act in his or her own self-interest, and you maximize profits, maximize consumption, establish private property in competitive markets, then you reach nirvana, a bliss, in which, by a mysterious force, the market, importance of the market, the maximization of profits and the maximization of consumption. So the maximization of profit by business, the maximization of consumption by consumers will be brought into a perfect balance with each other, believe it or not. A harmony will exist between the private interests of everybody. Jesus, that's an idea. That's why it's so famous. So now you've got two different theories. You've got one, the private market produces anarchy, helps to produce exploitation. The other one, yes, they may be business cycles, but as the gentleman said, they will self-correct if you leave the invisible hand alone. That's two different theories of capitalism. So it's at stake. Two different theories. I want to finish the points as you ask your questions. It's got to do with what you studied, or many of you have studied. So we've got on one hand Mr. Smith, 1776. Roughly 100 years later, we got Mr. Marx in the 1870s. And then in the 1930s comes a third man. His name, as I mentioned to you, and then you've studied him, John Maynard Keynes, Keynes. A third theory, economic theory, different from these two. Mr. Keynes comes along and says, I love private property. And I love private markets. I love capitalism. He was a very successful capitalist. Besides being a professor of Don at Cambridge University, leading university in England, he was also a very successful capitalist. I love capitalism, and I can't stand Marxism. But we got the 1930s on our hands. We got a Great Depression around the world. We have unemployed labor, we have unemployed capital, and not only that, we've got these little Marxists running around stirring people up, saying get rid of it, because they're reading this book in the books that I've assigned you. And we're going to lose it all because of the Great Depression. And you ready now, man? Look at me. The market is not self-correcting. There are barriers operating to these markets, said Mr. Keynes. There's a barrier in the labor market, there's a barrier in the money market. The savings and investment schedules that you learn, they don't operate the way the Smithians said, who are neoclassical theorists. They just don't work that way. I'm going to give you now a new theory of how capitalism works, different from the one you articulated. That markets don't clear. Or, if they clear, it takes so long that those Marxists are going to destroy us. I want to save capitalism, not destroy it, says Mr. Keynes. So here's what we have to do because of these barriers operating in these markets. We need a way to get more spending in the society, to shift that demand to the right, to clear the markets, because of these barriers. If you drop your prices, you'll drop your wages, you drop your prices, you'll drop your wages, and we'll have a worse recession. How the hell do we shift the demand to the right if people aren't spending because they're unemployed? And business is not going to invest because there's unemployment. They can't sell their goods, why the hell should they invest? What are we going to do? But his solution was that the state had to step in to spend to get the economy to full employment. Because the markets weren't clearing, or it would take so long, it would be a disaster. So Mr. Keynes comes up with a way to save capitalism through a reform. We have to reform capitalism by running a deficit when there's a recession. The neoclassicists are not silent. I mean, they're silent during the Great Depression, but they bide their time. They're not silent. They come back and they go to work against Mr. Keynes and that theory by showing that the Keynesian intervention prolonged the Depression. And the guy's name who did that was an American. He died a few years ago. He's the most famous, one of the most famous American, not the most, one of the most famous American neoclassicists. You know his name? Yes, sir.
Milton Friedman?
Bravo. So his name was Milton Friedman. He taught for years at the University of Chicago. In fact, he was so famous, it was kind of a Chicago approach to economics. So basically, it was Adam Smith in a modern version, but a very sophisticated version. And he argued, his entire life appeared on TV. I heard him debate. I heard him present lectures when I was a student years ago, many years ago. He argued very coherently, very logically, that if you leave people alone, just what we just did, maximize their own self-interest, it'll all work out. The Keynesians came back, you're crazy. Friedman came back, you're crazy. So you had a debate, and to this day, amongst these different theories. And both of them were fearful of the Marxian, which presented still a different view to these two different theories. Those of you, leave the market alone, do nothing. Neoclassical theory and Mr. Smith. Do something, Mr. Keynes, Marx. If you leave it alone or you do something, you're not going to get rid of class exploitation in this business cycle. That's the argument of these three great theories. Yes, sir?
Okay, so couldn't there be another argument that in the supply and demand, full social costs and full social benefits aren't represented, so it's because the markets are incomplete that number two of Adam Smith's point doesn't work out?
I'm going to give it to you. You just anticipate. But good for you. We're going to do this. We'll do it. Other people come along and they try to, isn't there a way of combining all of this stuff to produce still another approach? We're going to do it. You're going to get an assigned reading. I'm going to do it in class, and you're going to get an exam question on it. Just what you just did, so you've got to be patient. But it would make sense because people would try to synthesize these different approaches. And I'm going to come back to what you just did in terms of what is called external economy, or diseconomies and so forth. Okay? But let me turn now to how you've done that with Missouri. That's the argument then for planning and against market competition. But I don't want you to, he stimulated this very important point, which is there are three great contending theories, and there are others as well, but at least three. The Marxian, that's 373. The neoclassical, that's 103, 203. And the Keynesian, 104, 204. So economics, as a field of study, is a contested terrain. Think of it that way. For the rest of your lives, you don't get entrapped in one particular person's theory. You can buy the theory. I have no problem with that. Love it. Embrace it. But understand that it's the theory that you're buying. Not the truth. It's a particular truth that people are putting forward at a particular moment in time. And economics has always been, to this day, contested. Arguments present. Unfortunately, it's often not taught that way. It's taught as if it were science. That is really bullshit. There are different theories, different scientific tools, different consequences on our lives. That's partly what what I'd like you to see. Mr. Bernstein. Okay, Mr. Bernstein, about 10 minutes remaining, I'll start him. He was born in 1850. He dies in 1932. He was a journalist, famous journalist of the day. He was a lecturer at the Socialist Party School in Germany. By the way, he was an elected member of the German legislative branch, the parliament. And he, along with Kautsky, is a protege of Mr. Engels. So these two, as I told you, these are the two most famous proteges, Kautsky and Bernstein. Bernstein, it's going to be difficult for some of you, because I just did it. It's good I just actually did what I did, because it's going to introduce you to a different theory. Bernstein criticizes almost everything that we just did. That's always difficult to hear a criticism. It's part of what we're doing, to understand that these are truth claims about the world. So Bernstein is presenting his particular challenge to Orthodox Marxism. And he does it from the left. He's a socialist and remains a socialist all his life. So it's not a challenge, a critique from the right, it's one from the left. Bernstein, in the book that I've assigned to you, it's very famous, the socialist, it's actually socialist, non-socialist positions, it's very famous. Bernstein, first thing he does is, one of the first things, is attack economic determinism. If you remember what we did, I started with Mr. Engels, and it's picked up by Mr. Kautsky, and it's picked up by many of these Marxists and socialists thereafter, is the idea that the mode of production, the relations and the forces, determine the economy. That is, determine the superstructure, determine everything. So the mode of production, if you know how the mode operates, if you know its laws, the relations and forces, we went through that, the correspondence, lack thereof, between relations and forces, if you understand that, you will understand everything else. The most important cause is the mode of production, and inside the mode, the connection between the relations and forces of production. That will determine laws and music and how people think and so forth. That's called, as I said to you, economic determinism. Economics is the ultimate origin of everything that goes on. The bottom line is economics. Bernstein comes along and says, no, it's not. And he's going to argue for the autonomy, for the independence of politics and culture as causal agents shaping the mode of production. So he's saying, going to argue that the mode of production is not the origin, it's not immune from change, it's complexly shaped by our politics and our culture. So he's got an argument against Mr. Engels and Mr. Kautsky. The economy then, and again, the economy, I mean the basic contradiction between the relations and forces is not the ultimate cause of everything he's going to show. It's also an effect of political and cultural changes. That's number one. He's also going to do something else, which you can't really, he doesn't say this, I'm going to do it, you can't read it in this, in what I was saying. He's going to argue against what is called in social theory a structuralism, which is present in the argument of Mr. Engels and Mr. Kautsky. They are structuralists. What do I mean by that? Well, both of these gentlemen think that our lives are ruled by hidden structures. And these structures have inner rules and laws associated with them, which rule our individual behavior. So in order to understand how and why people do what they do, you have to understand so-called the laws of gravity of society. We've seen that with Mr. Engels and Mr. Kautsky. The law of gravity there is the relationship between, or the connection between the relations and the forces of production. If you understand the structure of the mode, you'll understand how and why people behave the way they do. Bernstein contrasts that, or you contrast that with what Bernstein does. He presents a humanist approach. Just opposite of this. He says, no, I think that changes in society result from human action, not from structures. Indeed, the human beings determine the structures, not the other way around, as you structuralists claim. Specifically, the choices of free individuals operating in a parliamentary democracy, and let me add to it because he's a European, a congressional democracy, he doesn't say that, he says parliamentary. The choices of free individuals operating in a parliamentary democracy, or a congressional democracy, can and do shape the economy. I reject the economy shaping everybody's choices. Instead, I'm having people's choices shape that economy. So it's an argument against the structuralism, as I said, of Engels. Now, to go back, this is, again, this is not Bernstein, but since we just did it in the class, I don't want to lose it. Neoclassical theory is a form of humanism. Keynesian theory is a form of structuralism. So one of the differences that people argue with each other is because there are different ways of viewing society. Smith's vision was that each and every human being could shape his or her destiny if you empower them. Keynes came back and said, no, there are these hidden forces that I'm going to explain to you, which are shaping the behavior of each and every individual. Macro theory. Why do people consume? Because they conform to the marginal propensity to consume. That's a hidden law of the structure. So I'm going to explain to you why you consume what you consume. Why you consume what you consume is 0.9. You'll consume 0.9 of your income. How do I know that? That belongs to the structure. Neoclassical theorists. No! I'm going to explain to you why people consume based on their careful utility calculus between different goods and services as dependent upon their income. And then I'm going to add them up and get aggregate consumption. Those are two different ways of looking at the world. That's why they struggle with each other, and that affects their view of markets as well. Okay, so Mr. Bernstein is a socialist, he's a follower of Marx, but like Smith, he's a humanist. So it's getting a bit complex. That's what he's embracing. He argues then, human agents, individuals in society, choose their destiny. They have done that. And they continue to do that. And they will, you're ready on he's going to go. And they will reform capitalism. There are no inevitable economic laws operating upon us, as Kautsky claims. He says, no inevitable laws emanating from that structure, from the relations and forces of production. So there's no, big move, there's no inevitability for capitalism to give rise to socialism. It's not an inevitable law. He breaks with Engels and Kautsky. There's no inevitable revolutionary crisis which will emanate in capitalism, the relations and forces which are going to produce the angry and upset workers, which will overthrow capitalism, which will seize the state and overthrow capitalism. He says, just the opposite. In capitalism, people, all kinds of people, workers, let's focus on that, workers have continually intervened via political changes to reform capitalism. That which Kautsky and Engels do not admit. Bernstein comes back in a different theory. He says, look, we have reformers, and many of them emanate from the workers themselves. They have reduced the inequalities of capitalism. Progressive taxes. Remember what I read to you about Marx and Engels? Progressive taxes, public education, blah, 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 blah. So all these different things have been introduced in society to reduce its unevenness and its inequalities. Factory reforms, universal suffrage, welfare reforms, tax reforms, and so forth. These are all the result of the strivings, the struggles of individuals, the human agent, to make choices to change the system which suppresses the individual. Those are the reforms, and they have improved the life of workers, says Mr. Bernstein. So, we have here a full-blown conflict between the reformers who follow Mr. Bernstein and the revolutionaries who follow Mr. Engels and Mr. Cousins. And why, before we break, and by the way, just remember, I forgot to play. Next Monday is a Tuesday for all your classes, and then we don't meet until a week from today. In Europe today, there is something called democratic socialism, or sometimes called market socialism. You asked me about. That is a complex historical, political, intellectual product of Mr. Bernstein. Whet your appetite. What exists in Sweden, France, and Germany, and other countries as well. Okay, so I'll see you a week today.